Cheok Jungyung's story filled my whole body. While the stories of Cheok Jungyung scattered through the starstream started to gather, it was a good story that improved the status of existence just by reading. The story Dragon's Blood has become known. The story Wiping Out an Army with One Sword has become known. The story Battlefield Slaughterer has become known. He was a strong man from birth. He was born with a dragon's bloodline.
Cheok Jungyung! Cheok Jungyung has appeared.
He cut 36 enemies alone.
From the time of Cheok Jungyung's birth until now, he didn't know about the scenario, but he had heard stories that were part of the scenario. The story Exiled from the Scenario has become known.
He's too strong. Exile him from this scenario. Use every means possible to send him to another world.
I watched the passing history and felt anger, sadness, joy, and frustration, just like Cheok Jungyung. After the bout of emotional feelings, Cheok Jungyung's face and solid body were seen. I had never seen Cheok Jungyung before, but I seemed to know him better than anyone else. This story was Cheok Jungyung. Why are you going so far to help me?
Who knows? Why?
5 constellations on the Gampang Yui were consumed in exchange for summoning Cheok Jungyung. However, the thing he was doing for me now far surpassed 5 constellations. No constellation would disclose the base of his story to an incarnation. In addition, Cheok Jungyung wasn't my sponsor.
I was like you.
One of Cheok Jungyung's stories flowed into my head. The story, One Who Fights Against Fate, has become known.
Please fate on him. This person has to die.
The words of the constellation struck me. I knew that Cheok Jungyung had been wronged. I didn't know he was affected by fate just like me. A long time ago, Cheok Jungyung experienced the same thing due to the constellations. I saw the rising notification windows. The story, One Who Fights Against Fate, has begun. Cheok Jungyung's story was my story. Cheok Jungyung laughed.
It isn't the same size as your fate. There was only one nebula who did this damn thing to me.
Cheok Jungyung spoke as he watched the world through my eyes.
At that time, I survived with the help of Hongik. However, I still often think about it. I shouldn't have received the help of any nebula.
Cheok Jungyung's spirit emerged from my chest.
That's why I want to help you.
He raised the sword in my hand and took a specific posture. The outer god who had almost swallowed the Founder's Mother roared. Cheok Jungyung also pulled out all his aura. The unbroken faith in my hand was crying violently.
A good sword.
The sword shook as in response to the mark. My magic power was reduced like there was a bottomless pit, while particles of pure ether gathered in my sword. An ether blade that was over 10 meters in length was formed. I shook from the formidable power and tried not to lose focus.
I will borrow it for a while.
My body was completely possessed by Cheok Jungyung, and I started to run with unbroken faith in my hands. It was an overload that I couldn't cope with, despite all my stats being over level 100. The bones in my body creaked, and the group exploded, forming a huge crater. I was confident that I could cut anything with this power. However, I was engulfed in a sense of despair as soon as I leapt into the void and confirmed the enemy. It was an emotion I felt while living in the human world. Could I kill such a huge thing? The outer god beyond the Great Hall exceeded imagination just from the size. The diameter of the body alone was at least 1 kilometer. Each of the 12 legs attached to the body had a diameter of several dozens of meters. Still, not even a fifth of it had passed through yet. If all of this guy appeared, who the hell could kill it? Cheok Jungyung read my despair and laughed.
I am Cheok Jungyung.
It felt like the world was listening. Or it was a declaration to the entire starstream.
The strongest military leader on the Korean Peninsula.
Then the sword moved. There was a moment when I didn't know what I was doing, despite being the one to do the action. It was the swordsmanship of Cheok Jungyung. 2-sword style, 2-sword mountain chop. Cheok Jungyung's sword moved. It wasn't a sword for cutting humans. It wasn't a sword for cutting monsters. It was a sword to cut nature. The blade that was over 10 meters moved twice in succession. This was a giant cracking sound. It looked more like darkness was flowing than blood, and looking closer, the darkness seemed like printed letters. I recognized it as the story of an outer god. In a way, the outer god was the same type of existence as the constellations. Along with a scream, the god's tentacles were separated from the torso and fell to the ground. It was like a huge building was falling. The astonished incarnations evacuated in all directions while I was surprised in another sense. A human could cut something like this. I felt awe for a being who was born a human but went beyond humans. However, a terrible pain came after the amazement. I started groaning from the terrible pain. A violent storm was battering my body. I shivered like a person electrocuted by hundreds of thousands of volts. The bones in the hand that swung the sword were destroyed, and my mind shriveled like a crushed bug. Strong power came with great responsibility, and in this world, the name of this responsibility was probability. Still, I wasn't ready to take responsibility yet. The constellation Goryo's first sword is looking at you. Cheok Jungyung was sharing the probability, but I was still too weak to handle his strength. Cheok Jungyung sighed. Weaker than I thought. Thought you could afford this much because you're a constellation. I wanted to say that he had too much brute strength, but my words didn't emerge. Instead of throwing up food, I threw up electricity. I sat on the ground and breathed out for a few minutes before I barely managed to escape the probability storm. I looked up and saw the scene made by Cheok Jungyung, the sword that cut mountains. Cheok Jungyung had turned 2 of the 12 tentacles into rags from the one attack. In other words, he cut 2 mountains. However, there were 10 mountains and the torso remaining. Cheok Jungyung's voice was dark. It's insufficient. It might be possible if I could use 3 swords. There are more than 3 swords? I haven't used it yet, but in your situation, I doubt I can even use 3 swords. I gritted my teeth. The summoning speed of the outer god was accelerating. Even if the scale of probability had almost been adjusted, the summoning continued, and it seemed furious from the blow. Is there any way to negotiate with that guy? Negotiate? How will you negotiate it? It's also a god. Cheok Jungyung noticed my intentions and interrupted me. If you're trying to save your mother, give up. It's a situation where the shadow of Founder's mother is eaten. Your mother's soul would already be scattered. It hasn't happened yet. The outer god doesn't eat its prey that way. It sounds like you're aware of the outer gods. Cheok Jungyung didn't know. I really did know the outer god. I once again looked at its appearance. The 2 giant tentacles and body were covered in a thick fog, making it not visible. The body, that was reminiscent to a giant canal, provoked cosmic awe just looking at it. There was no doubt. Cheok Jungyung of the 136th regression fought against this very god. In fact, while I was sitting down and trying to breathe, Cheok Jungyung was fighting against another tentacle. By using the power of transcendence along with giant body transformation, Cheok Jungyung looked like a half-god who had descended. The power of breaking the sky's sword had moved over a tentacle and it shook painfully. Using his own strength, Cheok Jungyung damaged the outer god. The level was still insignificant compared to Cheok Jungyung, but Cheok Jungyung spoke in an admiring voice. This reminds me of me in my prime. With this type of talent, he might be able to catch up with me after a long time. Cheok Jungyung avoided the moving tentacles and cut off 1/3 of a tentacle. However, there was still a limit to the blow he could deal. Cheok Jungyung stepped back and gasped. Kim Dokja, this guy is the Eater of Dreams. I met him in the 2nd regression. Once eaten by him, you will live in his space for the rest of your life and have your stories extracted. You must never enter his mouth. It was information I already knew, but I nodded anyway. As Cheok Jungyung and I were recuperating, the summoning of the god kept accelerating. Now almost 1/3 of his body was summoned. The summoned tentacles started to riot, and the landscape of hundreds of meters around them was completely devastated. Some incarnations screamed as they were hit by the tentacles. The Eater of Dreams wasn't a great old one, but it was still a cosmic god. The stories from Earth couldn't deal with it unless they joined forces. Cheok Jungyung spoke in a dark voice. If he fully descends, it isn't possible even with my strength. We have to attack now. However, the situation wasn't advantageous to us at all. Sparks flew as soon as Cheok Jungyung pulled up his story again, crushing my heart. This damn probability doesn't help at all. This was all the probability I could use despite the outer god being summoned. The meaning of this was simple. Someone had assigned the amount of probability that could be used to us. It was stupid to ask who was behind this. I bit my lip and blood flooded down. We still need to do it. Use the 3-sword style. Your presence might disappear if I use it. This is the only chance. Cheok Jungyung, join forces with me this time. Cheok Jungyung nodded. I once again started running with unbroken faith in my hand. The sparks of probability flew with every step that I took. Would it be possible? I didn't know. This time I might really be crushed by the probability storm. Still, I had to do it. I had always done it, and it would be the same again. Before I could even run 10 steps, the probability grabbed onto my ankle again. This time the recoil was greater. As expected, it was impossible alone. I needed someone's help, but who could help me now? It was different from the time with the absolute throne. The constellations who tried to help me now would become enemies with the huge nebula. The constellation Maritime War God is looking at you. The amount of sparks around me was gradually decreasing. The Duke of Loyalty and Warfare, Yi Sun-sin. He led the upper grade constellations of the Korean Peninsula and contributed to my probability. Cheok Jungyung was slightly touched. Duke of Loyalty and Warfare. There was a story that you were more likely to become a narrative grade than me. The constellation Maritime War God is nodding lightly. Well, okay, the story's added. Are there any more? Are there no more constellations courageous enough to confront this god? The sky was silent. Apart from the Duke of Loyalty and Warfare, no one else took on my probability. Then Cheok Jungyung's angry roar emerged. Baldy! Come quickly and help. Aren't you someone who fights for justice? The constellation Bald General of Justice bows his head. Fucking one-eyed jerk, what are you doing? The constellation One-Eyed Matria is tightly holding his eye patch. Cheok Jungyung shouted towards the world without worrying about his probability being wasted and his status being damaged. All of you are hiding even in this situation? Aren't you constellations? General? Maitreya? King? You don't deserve to be called this. The constellations of the Korean Peninsula are silent at the words of Goryeu's first sword. Yet there weren't any constellations who moved. At this moment, a figure staggered in the distance. The woman breathed roughly as she reached out to the side. It was Min Jiwon. Fortunately, she was alive. The constellation Lady of the Brocade Sleep is looking at you. Then a message was heard. The constellations of Sia are bearing your probability together. The constellations of Sia were helping me. It was a modest level of help, but they were still constellations. The nebula Vetus feels resentment towards Lady of the Brocade Sleep. The constellation Lady of the Brocade Sleep is exhausted from the excessive probability and has fallen into a deep sleep. A constellation closing their eyes meant they had suffered significant damage to their existence. Even so, the will of the Lady of the Brocade Sleep seemed to have affected the other constellations of the Korean Peninsula. I felt a pricking sensation as eyes started to gather on me. The constellation Bald General of Justice says he doesn't care and is looking at you. It started with Samyongdong. The constellation One-Eyed Maitreya is looking at you with half an eye. The constellation King Hengmu the Great is swearing as he looks at you. The constellation First Spiritualist of Joseon sighs and looks at you. The sparks covering me dwindled in an instant. It was finally turning into a likely probability. The nebula Olympus declares that the Maritime War God is an enemy. The nebula Papyrus is furious at the constellations of the Korean Peninsula. Thanks to me, the whole Korean Peninsula was covered with war clouds. Cheok Jungyung laughed. This is why I curse this land, but I can't leave. Fighting to the death with a few people. The minimum preparations is reached. Finally, Cheok Jungyung prepared his 3-sword style.